Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant, bringing you more Star Trek and Star Wars material. And this week, we've really got to talk about the armor being used on each side. Also, there's a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel. Alright, if you've watched the channel much, you know that I've been cherry-picking feats of strength from Star Wars and Star Trek based on them actually doing something that's real-world quantifiable, since the ships are made of Macguffinite, and so blowing one up might be impressive, but there's no real way to actually quantify anything, since it's just a battle between technobabble, magic weapons, and Macguffinite armor, so who knows how much damage is actually being thrown around. Hence the cherry-picking. Not all examples are all that useful for comparison. Heck, if you go by what's in the Star Trek Next Generation tech manual, the Enterprise should really only be capable of outputting a few megajoules of energy, maybe a few gigajoules with its phasers, but it demonstrably goes far beyond this, and the particles that the phasers are actually shooting are nadions, which are supposed to disintegrate matter on their own, so really phasers are more akin to a super soaker shooting acid, and the energy on target doesn't really get reflected by the energy pumped into the system. All that to say, it's very nebulous. But in this video, I am talking about armor. With all fiction, the durability of any defenses, including armor and shields, is totally dependent on how durable or fragile the writers needed to be at the time. So I'll be focusing more on how they actually work in general and how effective they should be conceptually, rather than trying to actually attach numbers to anything. We'll start with the basics. Armor in Star Trek and Star Wars has a few jobs to do. At the most basic level, the hull of a ship needs to keep things like air in, and anything randomly floating around in space out of the ship. Typically, hulls are pretty delicate and aren't really meant to resist much damage. Layered on top of the hull will be multiple layers of protection, including armor plating, a blade of armor, and shields. And these are all there to protect the ship from direct attack in the various extreme environments that the ships happen to encounter. I'll steer away from talking about shields in this video, however, since they're their own can of worms. Alright, let's get specific, and I'll start with Star Wars. Keep in mind that none of this information is actually on-screen canon, so take everything that I say with a massive grain of salt, but I'll do what I can all the same. Starting with ship armor, there's a few named varieties, including Durasteel, Dura-Armor, Quadanium Steel, and Quantum Crystalline Armor. Of these, Quadanium Steel seems to be the cheapest and most available, and it's what is used to protect most ships from incoming fire, everything from the TIE Fighter solar array frames to the Supremacy Dreadnought to the Death Star. It's not particularly durable based on what we get to see on screen, being regularly damaged by even handheld blaster fire at times, but it's certainly better than nothing. Moving up a step in quality, we have Durasteel, an alloy made primarily of zirconium, which is a fictional MacGuffin metal made for Star Wars. Durasteel can withstand vibroblades and force pikes and even resist lightsabers, though of course sufficient time and effort will be enough to penetrate the armor. Next up, you have Dura-Armor, and here's where we start getting into confusing territory because Dura-Armor is an alloy of zirconium, like Durasteel, but with iamite, another Macguffinite ore, and neutronium. Ooh, now we're getting into the good stuff. Except that, hang on, neutronium isn't an element. It's the product of extreme gravity upon matter, which is what occurs in neutron stars, where the pressure is so great that there's no space between subatomic particles, essentially meaning that a neutron star can be thought of as just one gigantic neutron. So if you alloy with neutronium, it stops being neutronium. It's just neutrons. So you might as well say that oxygen is a neutronium alloy since there's neutrons in it. But wait, the information on Star Wars neutronium is actually hyperlinked in the wiki. Maybe that will explain what's going on. Oh, it's just another magical MacGuffin metal. Apparently, back in the Sith Empire days, they made everything from blades to speeder bikes out of the stuff, and there's veins of it you can dig up on plenty of worlds. Alright, open letter to all sci-fi writers. If you're going to use the name of a real-world thing in your stories, please do any amount of research first. You are confusing the nerds. To be fair, though, a neutronium speeder would in fact be self-propelled, straight down. And the driver would end up being a veneer of person paste smeared across the thing as the intense localized gravity just smashed them into oblivion. Seriously, I had AI do a little math for me. If a speeder bike were made of neutronium, its weight would go from about 150 pounds to 200 trillion tons, more than all of the oceans on Earth combined, and its mere presence on a planet would cause a localized black hole effect, causing cataclysmic damage to the planet. Yeah, when they say neutronium, they don't mean neutronium. Back to Dura-Armor. This stuff was tough enough that blaster bolts would actually bounce off it, so it's pretty impressive, but sufficiently powerful weapons could just punch through all the same, or, persistence. Finally, quantum crystalline armor, or layered molecular armor, or just quantum armor, is basically indestructible to Star Wars weaponry. It's constructed layer by layer of densely packed atoms and it's extremely difficult and expensive to fabricate. The only ship to ever sport the stuff was the Suncrusher, and it could even fly into stars without taking damage and survive the ensuing supernova when it destroyed a star using its special resonance torpedoes. On the ground, all Star Wars factions make use of armor. At minimum, helmets, all the way up to powered exoskeletons. Your typical stormtrooper wears armor made of plasteel, which as far as I can tell provides minimal protection, being defeated by blasters, sticks, and arrows. At the higher end of quality, some applications of Durasteel could be scaled down to be made into highly effective armor. Mandalorian Beskar, as shown in the Mandalorian show, provides extreme protection against blasters and even lightsaber strikes, though it was quite expensive and rare, and a similar kind of armor used by Captain Phasma, which could deflect blaster bolts, was made of chromium. I'm going to reiterate, open letter to all sci-fi writers. If you're going to use the name of a real-world thing in your stories, please do any amount of research first. You're confusing the nerds. You see, chromium, or chrome, is a real-world thing. You know what it's used for? Making stuff shiny. It's also got some decent alloys like chromoly steel, but it's not particularly rare or mystical in its properties. Or maybe normal chromium is super rare in the Star Wars universe and we've all been armor plating our hubcaps to make them look pretty because we're just so wealthy here in the Milky Way galaxy and on Earth in particular. In Star Wars, chromium is rare, and it's really valuable, and it's used by people who want to flaunt their wealth a bit, like the Naboo royalty. That's why their ships are so pretty and shiny. Finally, I want to talk about Corttosis. This stuff is amazing and actually fairly well thought out, so of course the only on-screen example of it is from friggin' Acolyte, which I refuse to watch. Anyway, kudos to them for actually making up a new material instead of piggybacking on one that exists and confusing the nerds. Corttosis is a fairly delicate metal that can nevertheless be weaved into armor plates to become moderately durable. The cool part is that Corttosis is absolutely amazing at conducting energy, so it is highly resistant to blaster fire by just dispersing the energy. And this dispersion is so effective that lightsabers even get temporarily shorted out by just contacting a Corttosis weave plate. Apparently back in the Darth Bane days, Corttosis was also being used to make ship armor, but presumably this wasn't all that effective since it had to be spread super thin because it's prohibitively expensive, so yeah, it didn't get used much in the other eras as far as I can tell. That said, even just a simple bracer made of Corttosis could provide a commanding advantage in a lightsaber duel, and a blade made of Corttosis has cropped up in a few stories and was used to almost take out Darth Vader himself one time. That said, it really wasn't all that good for resisting kinetic damage, so it might stop a lightsaber, but it'd be less effective against a baseball bat. Alright, let's move on to Star Trek. On ships, there's really only a couple main varieties of armor, and most ships rely pretty heavily upon their shields. That said, there's a couple varieties of hull plating, reinforced by structural integrity fields and polarization, and a couple forms of ablative armor. I'm not finding a ton of information about what hull plating is actually made of beyond it existing, but one of the main materials is titanium, which is supposed to be 21.4 times harder than diamond, and its natural state was beyond the capabilities of even next-generation era Federation's weapon technology to melt, at least using the relatively low-power handheld weapons. Clearly, once worked into hull plating, the phasers were quite capable of melting this stuff, as we see ships get blown up all the time. Here's a case where the writers were throwing out figures which sound super impressive without really thinking them through all that well. Demonstrably, it isn't the case, but the implication with ultra-hard materials is that they're brittle. And any material that doesn't just fracture but shatters when damaged could be really, really bad for ship construction. I don't know, maybe when they actually make hull plating out of it, they lose some of the hardness in favor of making it not just disintegrate when hit. That said, the thermal properties are certainly very impressive. And my favorite example of this was in the Next Generation episode Descent Part 2, when the Enterprise hid from some Borg in the corona of a star, heating the hull in excess of 12,000 degrees C before metaphasic shielding could be engaged, which then dropped the hull temperature to a balmy 7,000 C. For reference, during re-entry, the leading edges of the space shuttle can reach 1,650 C, and the highest melting point of any element on Earth is that of carbon, assuming no oxygen, of course, at 3,500 C. So whatever titanium alloy is used to make Federation hull plating is just insane stuff. In addition to the natural resilience of Federation hull plating, they also have the ability to augment their durability, initially by polarizing the hull, as seen in Enterprise, and then later through the use of a structural integrity field which not only allows ships to survive extreme forces involved with warp travel, but also do things like get it close enough to black holes to experience some pretty extreme time dilation without turning into spaghetti. All that said, normal hull plating without shields is regularly thrashed by all Trek ship weapons, be they phasers, torpedoes, disruptors, or something else. To help augment this protection, ablative armor was introduced and used to great effect by ships like the Defiant. Ablative armor is actually a real thing, and basically consists of a sacrificial layer of armor which is sectioned and burns away at a controlled rate. This has the advantage of significantly limiting the potential damage of a single hit, but it's relatively costly and time-consuming to maintain since whole sections get burnt away and have to be replaced. That said, it's still cheaper than having to replace an entire ship. The most advanced version of this ablative armor was showcased in the Voyager finale with the ablative generator, which could rapidly encase any ship in a layer of ablative plates which render the ship highly resistant to all damage, including the combined firepower of a bunch of very annoyed Borg. Hooray for time travel tech cheating! The ablative armor generator isn't very well explained. Either the armor that it deploys is just crazy durable on its own, or, my own personal theory, it's a dedicated industrial replicator which replaces ablative armor sections as they get burnt away, so as long as you keep powering it, your ship basically is immune to any damage that doesn't just one-shot the whole ship. Finally, the most amazing armor in Star Trek is neutronium, and in this case, they actually mean neutronium. There's only been a couple ships in the entire series that have incorporated neutronium armor, the Doomsday Machine from the original series being a prominent example. Neutronium as armor comes with some pretty extreme pros and cons. On the plus side, anything armored with even a thin layer of neutronium is basically indestructible to pretty much all Trek weapons. I'm sure there's an exception, but we'll just say all of them. On the minus side, even cladding your ship in a very thin layer of the stuff would probably kill your entire crew from the extreme gravity that it generates and the radiation it emits. Also, the mass of your ship would be increased dramatically, so you'd need a crazy powerful core to just move. The Doomsday device got around these issues by not having a crew to poison and kill, and by eating entire planets for fuel. Not exactly efficient. On the ground, armor is relatively limited. Starfleet basically just doesn't bother with it at all, though there's been some attempts in the past. The Klingons use some, but it's pretty much useless against phasers and disruptors, and really only helps protect against glancing blows from blades, which is surprisingly helpful on a Klingon ship. There's also been a few alien factions that have made good use of armor that actually could resist phasers, such as the Hirogen, but the implication here seemed to be that this armor is quite expensive and bulky, but you'd think that Starfleet would provide a couple suits of armor like that for their security personnel anyway, since they're getting shot all the time. Whatever, you can tell I'm not in charge. I think the main reason that armor doesn't see much use among the main Trek factions is because a lot of the weapons are so powerful that you'd have to invest just a crazy amount of resources into armor that can actually resist them all. And even then, there's always a bigger, badder gun to be had. That said, I think I'd prefer any kind of armor over nothing if I was going into a firefight, except for Stormtrooper armor. That stuff apparently not only provides zero protection, but also actively impedes the wearer's vision. Clone Trooper armor, though, would be fantastic. They get a whole heads-up display and everything. And with that, I'll wrap this up. What do you all think? Did I manage to skip over some super important armor on either side? Honestly, that wouldn't surprise me too much, but I think I did all right. Let me know in the comments. Again, I have a coffee link in the description if you want to support the channel, and until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.